This will be for the Kuta software worksheet, similar right triangles. So for these problems, one of the theorems we're going to be using is the geometric mean or altitude theorem. Okay, let's take a look. So right here, we have a right triangle. All right, and if you start at the right angle of the big triangle and draw an altitude perpendicular to the base, this right here, CD, is your altitude, okay? And CD is going to be the geometric mean of AD and DB. So this is AD and DB. The geometric mean is the square root of the product. So you take CD, and that's going to equal the square root of AD and DB. So that's AD times DB. All right, so we're going to be using this formula on the worksheet. Okay, they want us to find the missing length indicated. Leave your answer in simplest radical form. All right, let's look at number 1. We can see the big triangle here has a right angle right here. All right, and when you draw in the altitude, you start at the right angle and you go to the base, and it's perpendicular to the base. So this line right here is an altitude. All right, and as a result, the altitude, which is x, is going to equal the square root of this and this. Okay, so this segment is 36, and that's going to be times this one here. If the whole thing is 100 and this piece is 36, this one here is just going to be 100 minus 36, which is 64. Okay, so this one here is 64.
Attention, please. Brian, say.
All right, so from here it's pretty easy. These are multiplied, but you don't need to multiply them until you finish. Here, if you do the square root of 36, that's just 6, and the square root of 64 is just 8. 6 times 8 is 48. Okay, please pause and try number 3. All right, we see the right angle here, and this is the altitude right here. That is the altitude. I'll just write ALT. Okay, so the altitude, x, is going to equal the square root of this segment, which is 9, times this segment here. Okay, the whole thing is 25, and this is 9. So this right here is just going to be 25 minus 9. Okay, so that is 16. All right, so we have the square root of 9 times 16. Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 16 is 4. And that equals 12. All right, let's look at number 12. We see the right angle here. This right here is going to be the altitude. Okay, I'll just write ALT. So the altitude is 6 radical 13. And that's going to be the geometric mean of x and 13. So that's going to be the square root of x times 13. All right, the way to get rid of the square root on both sides is to square both sides. All right, so when you square this, remember to square the 6 and the radical 13. So basically the exponent has to be distributed. So this is going to be 6 squared. And this is going to be radical 13 squared. Okay, and radical x times 13 squared, you just remove the square root. So it's just x times 13. Okay, 6 squared is 36. And radical 13 squared, you just remove the square root. And that equals x times 13. All right, and to solve for x, the opposite of times 13 is divided by 13. It cancels here, and it cancels here. X equals 36. Okay, please pause and try number 14. And I'll give you a hint. If the whole thing on the bottom is x, and this is 64, this right here is going to be x minus 64. All right, and to remove the square root, just square both sides. All right, so here's the right angle. This right here is going to be the altitude. So that is 48, and that equals the square root of 64 times x minus 64. Okay, in order to remove the square root, we're going to square both sides. .48 squared, I'll do on the calculator. And I get 2304. And this whole thing is under the square root. When you square it, you just remove the square root. So that's going to be 64 times x minus 64. Now, you could distribute this 64, but since we want to get rid of it anyway, maybe this is divisible by 64. So I'm going to check on my calculator and see if it is. Okay, and this is divisible by 64. So what I'm going to do is just divide both sides by 64. Okay, this whole thing is times 64. The opposite of times is divided by. So 2304 divided by 64, that's going to give us 36. 64 over 64 cancels, and we're left with x minus 64. Finally, adding 64 to both sides. 36 plus 64 is just 100. Bring down your x, and 64 minus 64 cancels. All right, so just remember to square both sides at first to get rid of your square root, and then you can work from there. Okay, so the other theorem we are going to use is the geometric mean theorem for the legs. All right, the first one was for the altitude, and this one will be for the legs. So we have our right triangle here. For the big triangle, the right angle is here. And if you go across from your right angle, that's your hypotenuse. Okay, the other sides of that triangle are called legs. So there's a formula for each one of those. For this leg here that I wrote in red, this is AC, and that's going to be the geometric mean of AD and AB. All right, so the geometric mean is the square root of the product, AD times AB. So you basically take the piece of the hypotenuse that is next to that leg and then multiply it by the entire hypotenuse and take the square root. Now for the other leg, I'll write it in blue. The other leg is this one right here, CB, and that's going to be the geometric mean of BD and the entire hypotenuse, which is BA. So that's the square root of BD times the entire hypotenuse, which is BA. So once again, you look at the leg, you take the piece of the hypotenuse that is next to that leg and multiply it by the entire hypotenuse and take the square root. All right, let's look at number 2. See, we have our right triangle. This right here is a leg. All right, so the leg is X. And that's going to be the square root of this, which is 9, times the whole thing, which is 25. Okay, the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 25 is 5. And that just equals 15. Okay, please try number 4, and I'll give you a hint. This is a leg. It's going to be the square root of this times the whole thing. All right, so this side length right here, that is a leg. And that's going to be the square root of this segment, which is 45, times the whole thing, which is 81. Now you want to simplify the square root. So 45 is the same as 9 times 5. And 81 we can do the square root of easily. So I'll just leave it. Okay, but the 45 I broke it up into 9 times 5. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 81 is 9. And we're left with the square root of 5. 3 times 9 is 27. And we're left with the square root of 5. All right, let's look at number 11. This right here, this side length, is a leg. Okay, and that's going to equal the square root of this times the whole thing. So 14 radical 6 is going to be the square root of 24 times the whole thing, which is X. All right. How do we get rid of square roots? We can just square both sides. All right, so I'm going to square that and square that. Now, when you square this, each one individually is squared. Basically, the 2 has to get distributed. So it's going to be 14 squared times radical 6 squared. And this squared, this thing squared, you just remove the square root. So it's 24 times X. Okay, 14 squared. 14 squared is 196. Radical 6 squared, you just remove the square root. And that equals 24 times X. Solving for X, the opposite of times 24 is divided by 24. It cancels here. And 196 times 6 divided by 24 is going to equal 49. Okay, please pause and try number 17, and I'll give you a hint. For this entire side length, what you're going to have to do for this side is add x plus 75. Okay, and remember to square both sides in the beginning to get rid of the square roots. All right, so this right here is a leg. So that's going to be 50 radical 3. And that's going to equal the square root of this segment here, which is 75, times the whole thing, which is x plus 75. All right. So we said to get rid of the square root, you just square both sides. All right, and these are individually squared, so we have 50 squared. And that's going to be times radical 3 squared. Squaring this whole thing just removes the square root. So it's going to be 75 times x plus 75. Okay, 50 squared, let's see, 5 times 5 is 25. And then you can just add 2 zeros. Radical 3 squared is just 3. And that's going to equal 75 times x plus 75. Once again, just like before, you can distribute here the 75 if you like, but I think we can just divide both sides by 75. It looks like it's going to divide evenly. Okay, so this whole thing is times 75. The opposite of times is divided by 75. So I'm just going to do that to both sides. Right here, it cancels. I'll do this on the calculator. And I just get 100. And that's going to equal x plus 75. All right, so on many of these problems, before you distribute, maybe you can just divide both sides by that number. And now it's easy. The opposite of plus 75 is minus 75. Cancels here. 100 minus 75 is just 25.